Again then, inshallah. Okay, so I'd just like to welcome everyone. Salam alaikum. Hopefully we can solve the voice issue and you can hear me now. This morning I will be talking about healthy eating for blood pressure management. And I was saying that I picked this topic because I think we all know someone who is living with hypertension or high blood pressure. It's one of the most common chronic conditions throughout the world. And there is a lot we can do in terms of healthy eating to help manage our blood pressure. Now, when we look at blood pressure, there are many factors that affect your blood pressure. There are your genetics, your lifestyle, your stress level, and especially the foods that we eat. Now, before we start to talk about the foods that we eat, let's talk about blood pressure and what it is. So did you ever wonder what blood pressure is? So when the doctor puts the cuff around your arm, what exactly are they measuring? Well, basically, what they are measuring is the force of your blood against your blood vessel walls. And you always get two numbers, a systolic and a diastolic. And basically, the first number is as your heart contracts. The second one is as your heart relaxes. So you have those two numbers. You might have heard 120/80 is a good blood pressure. Now, what happens when your blood pressure starts to rise? Symptom-wise, you usually don't feel anything at all. It's fairly silent. But in your body, your heart is having to work a lot harder, so it's putting a strain on your heart. Your arteries are becoming damaged, so they're becoming scarred and less elastic. We know when your arteries are damaged, again, things like cholesterol can stick to them more, and it is a bigger stress on your system. We know that uncontrolled high blood pressure is a major risk factor when it comes to things like strokes, heart attacks, heart failure, and also kidney failure. And because it is silent, it is something that we need to keep on top of, to get measured on a regular basis, and do whatever we can to keep it under control. Our risk for high blood pressure increases as we age or as we get older. Now, I apologize to those of you who are living outside of North America. My stats are mostly from North America, but I think the story is similar in many parts of the world. I was in Africa last summer, and even among villagers in rural Africa, high blood pressure was a big issue. So it is a worldwide issue. But if I were to ask, how many Americans are living with high blood pressure right now? What would you think? It's actually 1 in 3, or over 75 million Americans who live with high blood pressure. That's a huge number. And surprisingly, only half of those who live with high blood pressure actually have it under control. So for the Canadians listening in, how many of us are at risk of developing high blood pressure during our lives? Actually, a surprising 9 in 10 of us have risk factors for developing high blood pressure in our lives. So definitely we want to lower those risk factors and prevent high blood pressure, or if we are living with it, to keep it under control so we don't cause other risks to our body and damage our heart. Now, before we come into the diet piece, what % of heart disease and stroke can be prevented by living a healthy lifestyle? What do you think? It's actually 80%, which is great. because there is so much you can do in terms of exercising, eating healthy, and managing your stress to help prevent these chronic diseases. Now, if we look at diet, many of you may have heard that too much salt in our diet is a big problem when it comes to high blood pressure. But there's more to the story than that. And there's been lots and lots of research done around hypertension and diet. And one of the landmark studies was called the DASH trial, or the Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. Now, some of you may have seen in the grocery store little jars of spice blend called Mrs. Dash. Well, now you know where the name came from. It stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. Now, in this trial, basically what they did was they took two groups of people. They put one group on your typical American diet, and they put the other group on what they call the DASH diet. Now, the DASH diet consisted of 7 to 10 servings of fruits and vegetables each day, 2 to 3 servings of low-fat dairy each day, all whole grains and cereals, so no white bread or processed cereals. These people were also given a handful of unsalted nuts and seeds at least 5 days a week, and their sugar intake was limited. Now, within both these groups, patients were put on different sodium intakes. Now, at the end of the study, what the researchers found was that in both groups, the lower the sodium intake, the lower the blood pressure. But when you combine that low sodium intake with that DASH diet, you have a further drop in blood pressure. And it was quite significant in just 2 weeks. And the higher your blood pressure to start off with, the bigger the drop that you saw. Now, when we look at blood pressure at sort of the cellular level, in our body, when our blood pressure is high, we actually have an imbalance of 4 different minerals. So on one hand, we have too much sodium, and on the other hand, you don't have enough calcium, magnesium, and potassium. So when we look at that DASH diet, if we look at fruits and vegetables, they're filled with vitamins and minerals, and especially the potassium. If we look at dairy foods, they're a great source of calcium. And then if we look at the whole grains and cereals and the nuts and seeds, those give us the magnesium part of it. So the DASH diet was a perfect diet in terms of managing and preventing high blood pressure. Now, you might notice it's very similar to the Mediterranean diet that we've talked about in the past. It's just more rigid in terms of sodium intake. So let's look at all these components in a little more detail. So if we start off with the sodium, our body actually needs some sodium to survive. We can't live without it. And our body needs about 500 milligrams each day. Now, when we look at foods naturally, so whether you pick up an apple or a carrot or a piece of fish, there's natural sodium in those foods, and that natural sodium is enough to meet our body's needs. So we don't need all that extra salt. Now, when we look at salt, and you take a teaspoon of salt, whether it's table salt or sea salt or Himalayan salt, they're all about 2,300 milligrams of sodium in a teaspoon. Now, that's a lot more than that 500. Now, when we look at the research and the guidelines, they state that, at most, we should be having about 1,500 milligrams of sodium per day. So that's roughly 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. Now, that's the guideline. So how much are we eating on average? Anyone know? The average Canadian is actually eating more than double what we should be eating. The average intake is about 3,400 milligrams every day. Now that's huge. Now, to cut back from over 3,000 milligrams to 1,500 milligrams is really tough. And in my experience, I know patients have a really hard time doing that. Now, from experience as well, we know that even if you get your intake to about 2,000 milligrams or less, you'll still see some benefits. Okay, so we're really aiming for between 1,500 and 2,000 milligrams a day. Now, oftentimes when I ask people with high blood pressure, do you use salt? And they say, no, I don't cook with salt anymore, and I don't use salt at the table. But when we really look at where all that sodium is coming from in our diet, it's not so much that salt shaker. So if we break it down, about 10% of the sodium we eat is that naturally occurring sodium that we get in our foods. Another 10 to 25% is coming from the salt shaker. So that's the salt we're adding in our cooking or at the table. But if you look, up to 75% of our sodium intake is actually coming from processed foods and restaurant foods. So those are all the foods that we buy in packages and the foods we eat out or get as takeout. Those are really the big culprits. So let me just show you an example. So here's a tomato. So here in Canada, we're not really in fresh tomato season, but we can get hothouse tomatoes. If you took a medium tomato, there's 14 milligrams of sodium naturally in that tomato. So it's not a big deal. We can eat lots of tomatoes and we won't overdo our sodium intake. But let's say you were cooking lunch today and you didn't have fresh tomato and you opened up a can of tomatoes. Half a cup of canned tomatoes on average has almost 300 milligrams of sodium. So a lot more than that fresh tomato. Now, if we open up a can of pasta sauce or a jar of pasta sauce, on average, half a cup has 749 milligrams. That's half our day's worth of sodium. And then if we look at ketchup, half a cup of ketchup has 1,300 milligrams of sodium. That's almost your entire day's worth. Now, hopefully we're not eating half a cup of ketchup at a time. But that's just an example to show you how the more processed a food is, the higher the sodium intake. And oftentimes we think, well, maybe it's there to preserve the food. But we definitely don't need, with modern canning and modern packaging, that much sodium in our foods. It's really there for flavor. And the interesting thing about sodium is that it's an acquired taste. When we're born, we don't know what salt tastes like. And if any of you have babies or young kids, you know you never add salt to their foods and they don't miss it. It's as we start eating salt that we acquire the taste for it. And the more salt we eat, the more salt we like. And manufacturers respond to that by adding all that salt into our foods. Now, the good news is when you do cut back on your salt or your sodium intake, you actually revert back to enjoying foods without salt and you don't miss it as much, but it does take some time. Now, in the grocery store, other culprits are sauces and condiments, canned foods such as soups, things in your deli. When we think of things in a brine like pickles or olives, those are high in sodium. And if we look at that picture in the middle there, that's soy sauce. Many of us use soy sauce on a regular basis. Have you ever looked at the numbers on a bottle of soy sauce? In 1 tablespoon of soy sauce, there's 1,000 milligrams of sodium. So what can we do? Well, use less of it and maybe choose one that's lower in sodium. And if you are using things like soy sauce and sauces that have a lot of salt, don't add anything else to your foods. Okay, so what about eating out? Many of us enjoy eating out. And One thing to remember is anything that's prepared in a restaurant will not only be higher in salt, but it'll probably higher in fat and sugar than things that we would prepare at home. And that's why it tastes so good. So when you do go to eat out, make requests. Let the server know that you're eating a low sodium diet. Ask them if they can prepare things without salt. Oftentimes it's the sauce or the gravy, the salad dressing, the extra toppings like the cheese and the beef bacon you might get on your burger that are loaded in salt. So watch those toppings and then maybe ask for them to be put on the side so you can control the amount you eat. The other thing is to be aware of healthy options. So sometimes we'll go in and we'll choose a soup or a salad, thinking that that's a great healthy option. But those could be the highest sodium items on the menu. And I'll give you an example. So if we look at something like a Caesar salad, an average side Caesar salad in a restaurant has 1,100 milligrams of sodium. And that's not coming from the lettuce. That's coming from the salad dressing, the cheese, the croutons, and any other toppings they've added. So be careful with things like that. Portion sizes often in restaurants are a lot larger than what we would eat at home. So don't be afraid to eat half, take half home, or share it with somebody. And lastly, in Canada, we now have calorie numbers on all our menus, but not sodium numbers for most restaurants. However, if it is a chain restaurant with more than 3 locations, they are required by law to give you the sodium content of their foods, and you can ask for it in the restaurant, or you can look it up online ahead of time so you can make the right choice. So just some examples I thought would be fun to look at. So let's say you went out for fried chicken. If you had a 2-piece chicken meal with some fries and a biscuit, how much sodium do you think is in that meal? Anybody want to take a guess? There's a whopping 2,862 milligrams. That's almost 2 days worth of salt in just one meal. That's probably not something we want to eat too often. How about a slice of pizza? So now we can get halal pepperoni. So if you got a large slice of pizza, there's over 1,600 milligrams in just one large slice of pizza. There's your day's sodium right there. Now, many of you will say, well, I don't eat fast food. I don't eat things like that. So how about a plate of biryani? So maybe this is at a function at the mosque, a wedding, or something that you've eaten in a restaurant. There's over almost 1,400 milligrams of sodium in one plate. So it's not just the fast foods. How about a shawarma? So if you had a small chicken shawarma, how much sodium is in there? 830 milligrams. So again, maybe not as much as the fried chicken, but still quite significant. And how about something healthy? So let's say you had 1 cup of vegetable soup, whether the soup was bought in the grocery store or something you got in a restaurant. How much sodium would you think is in that bowl of soup? 930 milligrams on average. And that's without a sandwich or crackers or anything else on the side. That's just the soup. So I guess the key message here is if you do enjoy soups, they're a great way to get your veggies in, but try to make them at home and make them from scratch. If you do buy them, you are going to look for the low sodium ones, and we'll talk about labels in just a minute. So the last example was just a slice of whole grain bread. And if you're sitting at home right now, maybe just grab your loaf of bread and take a look at the sodium. I've sort of given you the answer down at the bottom, but the average in a slice of bread is 150 to 200 milligrams of sodium. And that might not seem like a lot, but if you had 2 slices of toast for breakfast and a sandwich for lunch, that's half your day's sodium right there. And when we look at the typical North American diet, it's the bread products, in fact, that are the highest sodium contributors on a day-to-day basis. So it's all that hidden sodium that we need to be careful about. So I think the key message here is to cook at home more often. The more we cook from scratch from whole ingredients, the better it is. We have control over the salt and the type of fat we use. It's always going to be a lot healthier than buying something that's packaged or buying something in a restaurant. We still want our food to taste good. And as I mentioned, as you cut back on salt, your taste buds actually enjoy other flavors a lot more. So start using more herbs and spices. If you like lots of masalas, that's not a bad thing. Enjoy it. Use herbs, spices, vinegar, garlic, lemon juice to add flavor to your foods without the salt. You can also buy things like Mrs. Dash that I mentioned or McCormick's that have salt-free spice blends, and those are fine to use as well. The one thing I caution against, though, are salt substitutes. Now, when we look at table salt, it's sodium chloride. If you go in the grocery store, you might see jars of jars of spices called no salt or half salt. And instead of sodium chloride, these are potassium chloride. And just as you can get too much sodium from regular salt, you can get too much potassium from these salt substitutes. And that's a dangerous thing for your heart. So I would stay away from the salt substitutes. But your herbs and spices are all good. Now, just talking about herbs and spices, a lot of these South Asian spice mixes that you get in the Indian grocery stores are full of salt. And they can contain between 1,000 and 2,000 milligrams of sodium, not per package, but per serving. So again, it's always better to use your own spices, start with whole spices and mix your own blends rather than buying the pre-mixed ones. Now, just some tips on looking at the label. So I think, for all of us, time is a factor. We don't have time to make everything from scratch. Sometimes things are not in season and we can't always buy fresh and we're buying things in a package. And that's where you can look at the label and make healthy choices. So if you look on your package, look for things that say no salt added or low sodium. Those are both regulated terms in North America. When you look at that white box on the back of the package called the nutrition facts table, you'll look for a low percent for sodium. And on the ingredient list, you want to check, is sodium in the first 2 or 3 or 4 ingredients? If it is, you probably don't want to purchase that product. So here's a close-up of a nutrition facts panel. So you'll notice for sodium, you get the milligrams, but you also get a percent daily value. And the easiest way to pick low sodium foods is just to look for foods that have 5% or less for sodium. And that's a good way to keep your sodium in check. So here's an example. So here I have a can of low sodium salmon. And salmon's great for all the omega-3s, good for your heart. If we look at the ingredient list on this salmon, we have just one ingredient, wild red sockeye. And if we look at the sodium, we have 85 milligrams or 4% sodium. Now, if we look at the regular sockeye salmon, now you'll notice there are 2 ingredients. There's wild red sockeye and salt. And now the sodium has jumped from 85 to 440 milligrams of sodium. So you've taken the 85 milligrams of natural sodium and added a whole bunch of salt to that product. So it is worthwhile looking for low sodium products, whether it's canned fish or beans or chickpeas or tomato sauce. There's quite a lot available now in the market, so that's a key. When you're looking at that hidden sodium, it's not just its salt, but anything that has that word sodium. So for example, MSG, monosodium glutamate, that's sodium. A lot of preservatives, example, sodium hydroxide, sodium benzoate, again, that word sodium will contribute to the sodium content. If it says in a brine or a broth, that's also a key for high sodium. When we think of things like baking soda and baking powder, people are often surprised to note how much sodium is in those. So when we look at a teaspoon of baking soda, it's going to have about 1,200 milligrams of sodium, and a teaspoon of baking powder is going to have about 500 milligrams of sodium. So if you're using a teaspoon in a big batch of muffins or something, it's probably not a big deal. But if you're using a lot in a small quantity of baked goods, that adds up. So what if you have a can of regular beans or lentils or chickpeas sitting in your cupboard now? Always rinse and drain them off before you use them. You won't get rid of all the sodium, but you will get rid of about 30 to 40% of it. So it is worthwhile to rinse them off. So that's the sodium part, or the salt part of the DASH diet and blood pressure. Now let's talk about the minerals that we can add to our diet to help lower our blood pressure. It's always easier to eat more of something than to eat less of something. So let's talk about the potassium, magnesium, and calcium. So if we look at potassium, that's the easy one. All your fruits and vegetables contain potassium. Your legumes, your dried cereals, grains, nuts and seeds, even your dairy foods contain potassium. So it's very easy to eat a high potassium diet. And in fact, one of the hardest diets to follow would be a low potassium diet. So that would be only if you were having kidney issues. But otherwise, I think for all of us, lots of fruits and vegetables, it's very easy to eat a high potassium diet. Now, if you remember, that DASH diet was recommending 7 to 10 servings of fruits and vegetables. That sounds like a lot, but servings are quite small and they can add up very quickly. So if you think of half a cup of cooked vegetables as a serving, 1 cup of leafy greens like a salad as a serving, and with fruit, if you think of, a fist or about the size of a tennis ball, that's a serving. Dried fruit would be about a 1/4 cup. And one of the tips I like to give is if you aim to fill half your plate at lunch and dinner with your fruits and veggies, it's easy to get that 7 to 10 servings in every day. And in terms of fruits and vegetables, the other key is lots of color. There are no magic fruits or vegetables, but it's variety in your diet. So getting lots of color on your plate and lots of different types of fruits and vegetables every day. Now, if we move on to magnesium, magnesium's quite the nutrient in research these days. We know magnesium is important in terms of nerve function, in terms of our blood pressure. There's research being done into magnesium and better sleep, as well as magnesium and blood sugar control and diabetes prevention. So a very important mineral. Your best sources of magnesium would be things like your legumes, beans, lentils, chickpeas, split peas. Your nuts and seeds are all great sources of magnesium. So you might remember from the brain health that a handful of nuts and seeds helps your memory. It's also helping your blood pressure. So grab that handful as a snack or use some natural nut butters as part of your breakfast every day. And then stick to whole grain. So when you have whole grain breads and cereals, they're also a great source of magnesium. Now, if we move on to calcium, this is probably the one that I find is hardest for people to meet their requirements for. Now, for an adult, the goal for calcium intake is about 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day. Your best source would be your low-fat dairy and alternatives. So if you take a glass of milk, whether it's skim milk or 1% or 2%, or a glass of almond milk or soy milk, they all contain about 300 milligrams of calcium per cup, or for 250 ml. So if you're drinking 3 glasses of milk a day, you're great for calcium. But I think most of us have a really hard time drinking enough milk. And that's where you want to look for alternatives. So whether you choose a yogurt or a lower fat cheese, that canned fish, so canned salmon, sardines, also an excellent source of calcium. And then to a lesser extent, your dark green leafy vegetables. So these green vegetables do contribute calcium, but definitely not as much as your dairy foods. So here are just some examples in terms of the calcium content. So you'll see milk up at the top with 300 milligrams per cup. Yogurt, also very close at 275 milligrams. But if you look down the list, if you look at the kale and the spinach, although they do provide calcium, it's not as much as the milk. So you'd have to eat an awful lot of kale to get the same calcium that you get in a glass of milk. Now, if we take a minute and we look at the foods that are in Islamic wisdom, we know there are many foods mentioned in the Holy Quran and in Hadith, and they've all been shown through science over and over again to provide many health benefits. Some of the ones I've shown here, if we look at things like dates or lentils or pomegranate or figs or even milk, we know these are all high in that potassium, magnesium, calcium, or all three of them together. We know foods like pomegranates also are very high in antioxidants, so they protect your heart, help lower your blood pressure. We know things like milk, other than the calcium content, milk also contains some types of peptides, which have been shown to be a benefit in terms of managing blood pressure. So there's a lot of wisdom in eating these foods on a regular basis. So try to include them as often as possible. Just to mention a few other foods in research that you might have heard. So there's always talk about garlic lowering blood pressure. And there are some studies that show it can have a benefit. There's some ongoing research, and I think we need some larger long-term studies to show the benefit in terms of how much and how long you need to take the garlic to see the benefits. There are other foods like flaxseed. There is quite a bit of research that shows that if you take in 2 to 3 tablespoons of ground flaxseed a day, that not only helps lower your cholesterol, but it can also help with your blood pressure as well. But I think the key is a lot of variety in your diet, as I mentioned. Now, what about supplements? So what if you don't like milk or you don't like vegetables? Can you take a vitamin pill? Well, it's important to remember that you can never replicate what's in a food into a pill. And the individual nutrients that you find in vitamin supplements don't really have the same blood pressure lowering effect as eating a whole food. We know whole foods contain lots of other compounds beyond the vitamins, things like phytochemicals and antioxidants that work together to give our body the benefits it needs. We also know with supplements that they can cause more harm than good. So oftentimes taking a high dose supplement can cause long-term harm to your health. And I'll give you one example. So we know that people who take high dose calcium supplements actually have an increased risk of a heart attack. Now that's not a great thing. So you always want to be careful with supplements, always try to get your nutrients from your foods first. And if you do think you need a supplement, make sure you speak to your doctor or your dietitian before you start the supplement so they can give you advice on the type and the dose that will work for you. The only exception to the vitamin supplement rule, if you're living in North America or in Europe, we don't get enough sun in the winter months. And vitamin D is something that we get from the sun more than our foods. So I know in Canada, Health Canada does recommend all adults take a vitamin D supplement, especially in the wintertime. But that's the only thing that we cannot get from our foods. So for everything else, try to eat a well-balanced diet rather than relying on these supplements. Okay, so what about sugar? So you notice that in the DASH diet, they limited sugar. And traditionally, when we think of sugar, we think of diabetes or we think of gaining extra weight. We don't think so much about sugar in our diet and our blood pressure. But the more we look at sugar and the more research that is being done, the more we know that sugar has a big impact on our cardiovascular health and our blood pressure. So when we eat a lot of sugar, the insulin our body produces goes sort of into hyperproduction. And we know that high insulin also causes high blood pressure. The insulin changes the way our kidneys deal with salt and water, so our blood pressure rises. And then over time, we know that if we eat a lot of sugar, we can develop insulin resistance. And that also has an impact on raising blood pressure by changing the way our body metabolizes and stores magnesium. So sugar does have quite a significant impact on our blood pressure and our overall health. So when we look at sugar, whether it's brown sugar, white sugar, molasses, honey, syrup, we do have guidelines for added sugar intake. And the World Health Organization and the American Heart Association have come up with guidelines for daily added sugar. Now, this added sugar would be the sugar either you're adding to your foods or a manufacturer has added to foods. It would also include free sugar. And free sugar would be the sugar that's separated from its original compound. So, for example, the sugar in juice would be considered free sugar. So when we look at the guidelines for sugar intake, for men, it's about 9 teaspoons or 36 grams per day. And for women, 6 teaspoons or 25 grams per day. Now, this does not include the natural sugar in your fruits and vegetables and in your milk. We're saying enjoy those, but just watch this added and free sugar. And let me give you a few examples. So how much sugar do you think is in a chocolate bar? Just your average Mars bar or Kit Kat. There's actually 42 grams of sugar in the average chocolate bar. Now, for most of us, that's beyond our daily goal. How about a donut? So if you took a chocolate glazed donut, how much sugar in there? 13 grams. So less than that chocolate bar, but quite significant. That's about 3 teaspoons of sugar. Now, you might be thinking, well, I don't eat chocolate and I don't eat donuts very often. But how many of us grab a coffee almost on a daily basis? So if you get that medium double-double, there's actually 22 grams of sugar in that coffee. That's a lot more than that donut that you're not eating. So it's beverages as well that sneak up with their sugar content. And if you choose a fancier coffee drink, like a cappuccino or a frappuccino, 66 grams of sugar. That's 2 days worth of sugar for most of us. So be careful of those liquid sugars. Now, how about that can of Coke, speaking of liquid sugar? The average can of pop has about 10 teaspoons or 40 grams of sugar. Again, that's more than our daily added sugar. So then again, you're saying, well, I don't drink fancy coffee or drink pop. How many of us drink juice? You know, the juice advertisers are saying it's a great way to start your day, have a glass of juice in the morning. But the sugar in juice is considered free sugar, and it acts very differently in our bodies than eating an orange. A glass of juice will give you almost 7 teaspoons of sugar. So, with your fruits and vegetables, always a good idea to eat them whole rather than drink them. When you eat the whole fruit, you get lots of other benefits, including the fiber, and the sugar is bound to that fiber, so in our bodies, it works very differently than the sugar in juice. Okay, so another thing that we often think is a healthy choice, yogurt, and it's a great source of calcium, but if you're choosing a fruit bottom yogurt, 24 grams of sugar in there. And it's just not the natural sugar from the fruit, it's the sugar they've added. So rather than buying these pre-sweetened yogurts, maybe think of buying a plain yogurt and then adding your own fresh fruit. So whether it's fresh berries or even frozen berries, it's a great way to get the sweetness that's coming naturally from the fruit without all that added sugar. Now, I'd just like to end off. I know I've been talking about diet, but exercise and diet usually go hand in hand. So we know that regular exercise combined with diet has the biggest benefit in terms of keeping our blood pressure in check. It makes us feel good, helps us manage stress, just good for our bodies overall. So when you're eating healthy, make sure you're exercising regularly as well. And to end off, our take-home message today would be just eat home-cooked meals made from fresh ingredients more often. The more you eat that's less processed, more homemade, the better it is for not just your blood pressure, but your overall health. And I'll leave you with some resources if you are interested in learning more about healthy eating, whether it's general heart health or blood pressure management. The first one is sodium101.ca. It's a great website in terms of information. They also have an app called Sodium 101, and you can download that to your phone, and it lets you type in any food and figure out the sodium content of that food. The next one is Health E University. This is something I've been working on through the University Health Network. And it's actually 3 different parts right now. There's the Cardiac College and Diabetes College, which have great resources on eating, exercise, stress management for dealing with these chronic conditions. And something brand new that's been launched just this month is something called Thrive. And for those of you who don't have a lot of time on your hands to read things on the internet or get a lot of information, Thrive is a set of 12 videos. They're each 5 minutes long. And so you just spend 5 minutes a week watching these videos, and each one gives you a tip on healthy living. So there are ones on diet, on stress management, on exercise, on sleep, and they're short and quick, and they're nice to share with people who don't have a lot of time to do research into health. The next one is Nutrition Action. That's for more for those of you who are really interested in nutrition. You want to know what the latest research is, but in an easy to understand format. It's a great newsletter. Their website is cspi.net, which is the Center for Science for Public Interest. A great newsletter. And the last one, for those of you who live in Ontario, Eat Right Ontario is a government-funded service, and it's a great service. You can call that 1-800 number and speak to a dietitian on any topic related to diet or nutrition, and they will give you an evidence-based answer. And they also have a great website with lots of information that you can print off. They have recipes and resources as well. So things to look at if you are interested in learning more. At this time, I'll open it up to questions. If you do have questions, maybe you can type them in and I'll do my best to answer them. Any questions? Anything that was unclear? Just wait one more minute. Okay, so the question is, how about exercise? Well, as I mentioned, exercise is a huge part in managing things like high blood pressure. We know that regular exercise will reduce your blood pressure by at least 5 to 10 points. So what we're recommending is, start with maybe about 30 minutes a day, at least 4 or 5 times a week. But that's, again, something you want to do to your tolerance, and maybe you can speak to your doctor about what's ideal for you. But regular exercise definitely is part of looking at overall health and blood pressure. Okay, so we have another question on the ketogenic diet. Okay, so great question. I'll just let you know, as a dietitian, the information I present is, number one, evidence-based. So I only talk about things that have lots and lots of solid research behind them and we know work. I also try to promote healthy eating patterns that are doable in the long run and are not so restrictive. So if you look at that DASH diet, or if you look at the Mediterranean diet that I've spoken about in the past, those are both diets that are very easy for anybody with any cultural background to follow. When we look at things like the ketogenic diet or the paleo diet or any of these other diets, they're more what we call fad diets. So the first thing they do is they eliminate a lot of foods from your diet. And I don't think that's a good long-term fix for anything, to say you can't have carbs or you can't have fruit in your diet. So you're missing many nutrients that way. You might see short-term benefits, but in the long run, we don't have any research to show something like a ketogenic diet is beneficial for the average person. Okay. So another question, what about time of day to take in fruits and vegetables? To my knowledge, there hasn't been any research to show that there are better or worse times to eat fruits and vegetables. I like to promote having fruits and vegetables at all your meals and snacks. So if you can get in some fruit at breakfast, that half plate of vegetables at lunch and dinner, it's a good thing. In terms of having them either before the rest of your meal or after your meal, again, we don't have any research to support benefits for either or. So I think just eat fruits and vegetables whenever you can, whenever you feel like. Any other questions? Well, I'd like to thank you all for joining in and listening. And thank you to the organizers for giving me the